Welcome to Ukraine Insights, the podcast where we bring you stories from the battlefields, the boardrooms, and corridors of power through voices that know Ukraine inside out. Brought to you by KI Insights. Hello, and welcome to another episode of Ukraine Insights, to the monthly edition on disinformation, propaganda, and hostile influence operations. My name is Adam Sybera, and today I'm here with historian and investigative journalist addressing threats to democracy, Dave Troy. Mr. Troy, thank you for joining us.
Glad to be here, Adam. Thanks for having me.
So let's get straight to it. Modern propaganda is less about beliefs and more about networks, money, and incentives. So how does propaganda actually work today?
Well, it's a extremely deep topic. We could go on and on for hours and hours. So we're going to try to condense things down into something digestible for people. But effectively, what you have going on in the world right now is kind of a war of worldviews, and Putin and some of his allies have a certain worldview. And, those of us in the United States that still believe in democracy have a different worldview. And there's a conflict there. So what's happening is propaganda, or another way to think of it is information warfare. It's kind of the stage of warfare that happens before kinetic conflict, is being used to wage this war of worldviews. And what you find is that it's less about, beliefs and, what I call isms, and more about what practically is going to achieve the outcomes that these actors are looking for. So, in the case of the Putin networks, there will be news stories that come out that, achieve an effect, so you'll have stuff going out about, the US blowing up Nord Stream or whatever. And, that's going to place a lot of pressure onto the United States and make people, feel, have uncertain doubts about the United States and its goals and stuff. And so it's that kind of thing. And it's just ongoing iterative warfare where, at each stage, new information is released out into the ecosystem that is intended to have effects. And then those effects in turn have an impact on the real world, and then they iterate towards whatever the next phase is beyond that. So it's a never-ending cycle.
And such a huge complex machinery, I imagine, takes some, someone has to fund this. Where do they get the money for it?
Well, so it's interesting, having studied this, in some detail for about, 10, 12 years. What seems to be the most successful is to set up what I call, self-sustaining operations. So, on the one hand, there's definitely money that's flowing into outfits like Tenet Media in the US that was, putting money into podcasters like Tim Pool and some others. But each of these sort of individual agents is set up in a way where they're able to kind of be entrepreneurial. And they end up generating their own income streams and, being self-sustaining. Now, granted, it may help them to have input and money coming from other sources. And of course, you've got various PACs, like Elon Musk's America PAC is dumping money into all kinds of things that we don't have great insights into. And so it's this combination of self-sustaining entrepreneurial kinds of operations along with, dark money and money coming from nation states that seems to be fueling most of this.
And you've kind of already hinted at it, but so some of these influence operations sort of hide in plain sight. And can you maybe bring to light more of this, when we talk about shell NGOs or dark PR?
I mean, there's just so many of these types of things that are out there. And, about the only way to keep track of them is to do long-term longitudinal network analysis and kind of see who's amplifying who over a period of time. So there's an outfit that you guys might know in Ukraine that a lot of Americans don't know called Allatra, which is a cult operation that's growing and has a lot of influence that's emerging in the United States. And I've been studying this outfit for some time. And, if you look at sort of who they move with and what they're trying to do, they're practicing something called entryism, which is sort of a information warfare technique where what you do is you go try to infiltrate existing established groups. So they've gone after groups like Rotary and Amnesty International and a whole variety of other things. And the guy who is Donald Trump's spiritual advisor, Mark Burns, is a big Allatra advocate. So, you find these kinds of networks everywhere, and, they're just very persistent in terms of, attempting to kind of keep advancing into different institutions and established organizations in order to steer things in the direction that they want to go.
So thank you for bringing us into Ukraine, because Ukraine, ever since, even before Maidan, but especially after Maidan, was somewhat used as a laboratory for all of these information operations led by Russia then. But I'm interested also how this tactic migrated globally and reflexive control beyond Russia.
Yeah, I mean, so the idea of reflexive control it was something that was developed in Russia in the '60s primarily as a sort of a formal defined science, and the idea is to induce your opponent, your adversary, to take actions that are what you desire them to do based on information and other preparations that you sort of send their way. So folks in the Russian sphere of influence, whether it's Ukraine or Georgia or Kazakhstan or whatever, have been sort of used to this for a long time, because they kind of know that, like, okay, well, this is what they're trying to do, so they're setting up this political party to behave a certain way so that they can achieve XYZ outcome. In the West, in the United States in particular, we have been really not exposed to that kind of stuff until the last 10 years or so. And so, as a result, what ends up happening is that Westerners, Americans, particularly American think tank, policy analysts and stuff, tend to project their Western worldview onto somebody like Putin, which isn't really correct. They sort of say, well, he's a rational actor, he will do X, Y, and Z. And it's like, well, no, actually, he's coming from a different place. Now, that doesn't mean he's not rational, but he's using a different kind of rationality. And a lot of times that rationality is rooted in these kinds of reflexive control campaigns. So, for an example, with somebody like a Donald Trump, the way to get the outcomes that you want from a Donald Trump is to go for his weaknesses, which are ego and money and status and women. And they did that to great effect over the course of decades. They figured out how to kind of play that guy like a musical instrument. And so, that kind of an approach where you kind of study your opponent, figure out what you want to get out of them, and then figure out what sort of energy to shoot at them to get the outputs that you want, that's what they've done. And so, again, in the West, in Europe, we've been much less exposed to this than you guys have in Ukraine. And as you say, for time immemorial, really, this kind of thinking has affected that Ukraine-Russia relationship, but it's new to us in the West, and so we're still kind of getting our sea legs about how to handle it.
So speaking of Donald Trump and how you sort of hinted at Russia grooming him, I also wonder, especially with sort of the rhetorical escalation, and not just rhetorical anymore, around Greenland. I cannot help myself then to see some of the tactics of both reflexive control and other information and influence operations, especially with sort of allied forces of the MAGA movement in Europe, to sort of imitate this tactic or basically do the same. So how much of it do you think is coordinated, or is it just something they sort of learned and see as a tool that works, and that's why they applied it?
Yeah, I mean, I think you have to, first off, I think it's really important not to assign too much, credit to Russia and the Kremlin and whatnot. I think a lot of this is very, improvisational, and it's not like there's necessarily some, grand master plan that they're executing, but it does have a direction and it does have goals, and they are responding in real time to what I would call battlefield conditions and doing what they can to get at each stage, things moving forward. I would argue that a lot of what they're trying to do right now is stuff that they thought they were going to try to be able to do 10, 15, 20 years ago, and they're just running late because it takes a long time to do a lot of this stuff. So I think, for that caveat in place, it's important to have. Now, with respect to Greenland, one of the interesting things about Greenland is that, the United States has been interested in Greenland and expanding presence there for decades. Harry Truman tried to buy it in 1946 for $100 million. And there were subsequent, conversations about expansion of presence there since then. However, Donald Trump got the idea from Ron Lauder, who is the cosmetics executive, connected to Estee Lauder, which turns out expanded into Russia in about 1987, the same time that Trump was being brought to, Moscow in 1987. And they actually, there was a luncheon in 1986 with hosted by Leonard and Ron Lauder that Trump was at, which is where Trump got sucked into this. So, it was Ron Lauder that gave Trump the idea to pursue this in 2019. And there is also discussion. I just did an article about this. It's on my social media accounts a few weeks ago that outlines that all of the ideas around Venezuela and Greenland, and even using those two things as a way to kind of advance this Monroe Doctrine idea that has now become, such a part of the discourse, was seen as a way to take pressure off of Ukraine from the West so that Russia would be able to pursue its goals there. So it's all kind of interconnected in one thing. And if you think of it as kind of like, okay, this is part of a program of reflexive control, what they did was they introduced this idea to Donald Trump. They stroked his ego. They called it the Monroe Doctrine, or somebody did within the administration, in order to sort of get him interested in it. And now this is happening. And, is Donald Trump wittingly working for Putin? I think a little bit, but I think also, if you think of it, this is just like a psychological manipulation campaign to get him to do what you want. That's kind of what's happening.
Dear listeners, if you're looking for more of our content, make sure to check out our website where you'll find all of our services along with our weekly analysis. Follow us on X, Blue Sky, and LinkedIn for fresh updates.
And, yes, I agree. And also from my perspective, it almost seems as if both Putin and Donald Trump have a common goal, and that is to attack democratic institutions and the order in, say, European Union works. And sometimes within their tactics, I see or I observe that it isn't exactly to persuade you about a position, but more to paralyze you. It's this weaponized skepticism, and to so how does propaganda erode trust in democratic institutions?
Well, I mean, to go to your original point, I mean, there really is an effort to kind of erode democratic institutions, and the sort of underlying ideology here, which I've traced across decades and centuries even, is this idea of, what kind of culture do you want to live in? Do you want to live in a culture that's sort of hierarchical and top down, where, the strong prevail and impose their will on everybody else? Or do you want to live in a world where there's more equality and more deliberation and more, democratic systems and all that kind of stuff? What's happening right now is people like Putin and Trump and Elon Musk and a few others are deciding, like, yeah, that hierarchical world probably would be for the best, because we'd be safer and we could control resources better and we could do, the things we want to do. And you don't have these pesky democratic societies getting in the way and screwing everything up. So to a very large extent, that's kind of this worldview warfare that I was talking about earlier, is that it's rooted in this idea of hierarchy versus democracy. And you can see why that's a potent point of conflict. It's a very different way of seeing the world. Now, as it turns out in practice, what you said was right. It isn't about convincing you of a position. It's about imposing a worldview on, sort of the subjects of the world. And so what you see in terms of discourse, a lot of times, online and in media these days, isn't so much a deliberation of ideas and a going back and forth over facts. It's more an effort to subjugate, the the other side, and sort of impose this worldview onto you. And if you don't prevail in that conflict, then, well, whatever, you're marginalized and you don't get listened to anymore. And so that's why politics is so toxic right now, is that it isn't really politics. It's warfare. So I think that's kind of the fundamental thing that people in democracies have to kind of get to grips with, is that all of this stuff that's driving this is removing our ability to have democratic discourse and replacing it with something else entirely.
It's I very much like that, how you just described that we moved away from traditional politics. I observed this in my hometown or native Czech Republic, where when you look at the political platform, it changed from a concrete agenda into sort of this football match where where a group of people supports one team no matter what happens, and another group supports another team no matter what happens. It's basically disregarding democratic institutions whatsoever. And I feel that often those democratic institutions sort of pull on the shorter end So why is it that our institutions fail to respond to network propaganda?
Well, I think you can look at the very word network to understand this, and this is something that I've been spending, again, years trying to get a handle on, and I think I sort of understand it at this point, which is that, when people talk about democracy and voting and whatnot, they think about it in terms of percentages. 50% of the people voted for this and 49 voted for that, so therefore the 50% wins. People are not quantities. They are not atomic in this way. They are connected in networked configurations. So when you talk about, teams and how people behave as if it's a sport type thing, the more radicalized people get, the more the social ties between their closest networks become hardened and kind of fixed. And over time, what can happen is people become so entrenched in their social networks that their identities become wrapped up in, a political position or a political party, or a sports team, or various other things, brands, what have you. And when that goes to its fullest extreme, it's really radicalization, and that's when you get people willing to commit violence on behalf of a political movement or something like that, or become terrorist or whatever. And God willing, we try to steer away from that, but it's still pretty close to that when you have people that are just so blindly committed to their political identity that they can't figure out a way to make democracy function because there's just no debate, there's no discussion. So I think that what's happened is that these bad actors, which I would consider Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump to be, have weaponized that tendency towards radicalization that exists on both the left and the right, and have made it so that democracy is no longer functional. And that serves their goal here. So I think in order for us to kind of unwind this, we need to figure out ways to complicate our social networks more so that we, in fact, do exist in multiple different, social spheres and are able to entertain different ways of seeing the world in good faith. But the problem right now is that we're stuck in these trenches and can't see the other side in anything approaching good faith, and with good reason. I mean, let's not mince words here. There are very few people acting in really good faith on sort of the anti-democratic side of this. So, we've got to figure out a way to untangle this, and it is rooted in this idea of networks. And one way that we could potentially do this is to start to fight back against some of the networked information warfare that we see with things that are intended to have the opposite effect. And unfortunately, that is not being funded right now, really. There's really nobody that's sort of had the aha moment to say, let's actually do this. In broad strokes, there are some countering efforts, but in terms of like a really deep, nuanced, networked understanding of all of this, we're still in the very early phases of figuring out what to do about this.
Which is a nice bridge to the next topic I want to open, since we're both journalists and we both cover this. I was wondering how to report on propaganda without becoming part of it, because often for propaganda, it's enough just to sort of repeat it. But as the nature of journalism is to describe what's happening, and sometimes you use your own platform to sort of amplify the narrative. So do you have any tips for journalists to how to work with this?
Yeah, actually, I do. Fortunately, a good while ago, in 2018, there was a really good report put together with best practices for journalists by a woman named Whitney Phillips, and it's called The Oxygen of Amplification. And I encourage anybody that's covering anything approaching this space to go give it a read. It's a 3-part PDF document available for free at datasociety.net. And what it basically recommends is, consider carefully whether you want to report on a specific propaganda topic, because you are amplifying it and making it, a subject that more and more people gravitate to. So, for example, if you're the New York Times and you write about some destructive cult, congratulations, you've just recruited at least a few people into the destructive cult. So you got to decide whether that's a good editorial and ethical decision. Beyond that, if you feel like you are ethically required, or it's worth covering something like this, then you should consider how you do it. First off, don't glorify the subjects. Don't provide entry points into the sales funnel for whatever radicalization pipeline this may be, or the misinformation that may be being conveyed. Be careful about how you portray these folks. Don't go take edgy photographs of them. The New York Times did a photo essay or an interview with Curtis Yarvin, and they made him look like a freaking rock star motorcycle guy, and it's like, no, that's not helpful. This dude is a dweeb who is participating in online message board discourse. It's not okay to make him look cool. So that kind of stuff I think has to be considered, and Whitney Phillips has just a very long list of good ways to think about this. And it's frankly, it's not as bad a problem as it was in like 2018, because most journalists have kind of gotten a sense of like that this is bad. But a lot of the kind of lesser quality outlets, your TMZs or your Raw Stories or whatever, that are sort of aiming for clicks, may or may not be following some of those guidelines. So you as social media users would be well advised to not amplify stuff that violates some of these principles.
And you've already touched upon it, and it's a source of frustration for me as well, because often we seek grants for projects and things like that, and sometimes, especially unfortunately around European Union, I see these grants, which one are barely cover the costs of a successful long-term project. And two, they're often focused on things like fact-checking, where we know that if you before I fact-checked all the lies, there's going to be 100 new lies. So why do you think, or that's already sort of the answer, but why does fact-checking not work and often strengthens propaganda?
Yeah, so fact checking tends to result in this kind of an interaction. A networked operation publishes some piece, often with a desire to get a reaction. The reaction is then achieved by either the public or by fact checkers. That then interfaces with the original producers of the material. And then they end up in a situation where they can use the reactions from the normie world as fuel to drive their original message, and also to alienate the originating in-group from the external out-group. So it's a very effective, fact-checking ends up being a very effective way to help the bad guys win. So, to some extent, a better approach with stuff like that is to sort of ignore the stuff that shouldn't be amplified and shouldn't be engaged with, in favor of actually tracking the originators of this stuff in terms of like who they are, what their goals are, who's funding them, how they're able to sustain their operation, and then publish reports about people that are driving this stuff. There was a really good report put out last year from the Network Contagion Research Institute about networks that were being fueled by a guy named Roy Singham, who was a US tech entrepreneur who actually moved to China. And he was fueling with his money a lot of these, anti-Israel, pro-Palestine riots in the United States. And, again, not to wade into that debate because that's very complicated. But point was, Roy Singham was fueling a lot of this, and they wrote it down, and that was worth doing. Fact checking, on the other hand, less so. And to your point about, funding and grants and stuff, everybody tends to treat journalism as a kind of a redheaded stepchild that doesn't really deserve the funding of other serious pursuits. And, I'll be honest, like I did not go to school for journalism. I have been dragged into this over the last 10 years or so as a result of my interest in data and research and stuff like that. And so I'm doing journalism as a kind of a citizen sojourner in the space, if you will. But I have a great deal of empathy for people, that have devoted their entire careers to journalism. And I really think that we need to start treating it more like a first-class citizen in the world of information warfare operations. And we also need to, treat it as a sustained effort. As you, point out, these little one-off things, they don't really have an impact because they can't. What we need is longitudinal, long-term study of the information domain so that we can understand what's happening within it and why. And that doesn't mean censorship or anything repressive. It's more just like who's doing what and why. Where does the money come from? What are they trying to achieve? And we don't have the long-term view to do that. So I've made that kind of my focus, is doing what I can from a data and information gathering perspective to map out specific networks of actors and try to understand why they're doing what they're doing. And even with that as a focus, it's still quite overwhelming because there's always something new and things are changing. So it's something we really need to focus resources on. And we used to have in the United States something called the U.S. Information Agency, that was kind of an umbrella organization that managed stuff like Voice of America and Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, all that kind of stuff, as well as a whole bunch of other information programs that help to advance the American point of view particularly in Eastern Europe. But that got defunded in like 1999, and we have been adrift since then. Now, VOA managed to sort of get out from underneath that umbrella and persist for a while, and now it's effectively been captured by the bad guys. So, we need better long-term approaches to doing this for real, not just these little ad hoc programs and grants.
So we spoke briefly about what was, briefly about what is. Now I'm curious, what do you think will be, especially with technological development and AI as a force multiplier, and how do you think automation will accelerate old tactics?
Well, this is something I've been spending a lot of time thinking about, especially over the last couple of weeks as things have been rapidly unfolding. What concerns me at the moment is that, we seem to be entering into a period of rapid acceleration where things are changing faster than anybody can really kind of keep up with them. And our ability for sense making has been strained for years, particularly in the last year. But now I think that our ability to, sense make is going to be outstripped by events. And so, AI definitely contributes to that because there is now just much more capacity for generating new information and for creating change than there really has been ever before. I would argue that the really important thing about AI isn't so much the intelligence aspect, because it's not that intelligent, and it's sufficiently capable to execute certain kinds of tasks. What is important about it is that it's an effectively unlimited supply, and we can use it to direct attention, so what I've been calling synthetic attention, at things that humans simply cannot handle. So, for example, you, like me, we have to sleep 8 hours a day. The computers do not. The computers can stay on and do crazy things all day and all night. And I have a few computers myself, but I could easily get 10 more and multiply my capacity for attention by 10, 12 times potentially. And anybody could do that. So we're entering into a world where attention becomes unlimited. And, if that's the case and things are changing very rapidly, it becomes very difficult to keep up with and decide how to respond. In warfare, there's something called a OODA loop, which stands for observe, orient, decide, and act. And it's something that fighter pilots came up with. A guy named, I think it was Boyd, was the guy who came up with that. But at any rate, the idea being that if you're in a fighter plane and you're going along and stuff's happening, you have to have some minimum amount of ability to kind of continually assess your situation, to take steps to react to what's going on, and then, reorient once again. You can only do that if things move at a human speed. If things are moving at a speed that's just faster than your ability to assess or to act or whatever else, then you're just lost. And there's I have a pilot's license, so there's an old pilot quote that I like, which is that, you've never been lost until you've been lost at Mach 3. Talking about flying like an SR-71. And I feel like that's where we are right now. We have never been lost like you are when you're flying at Mach 3. So, things are just moving really fast. And so I think that, going forward for the next, year or two, we're going to go through some stuff that will be disorienting, difficult, costly, probably harmful in many ways. There might be some good things to come out of it. Who knows? But I don't think anybody can predict where this is heading right now. The one thing I would say, though, is that, we need to, those of us that are on the, pro-democracy side of things need to get our act together and get together to try to trade notes as much as possible to try to come out on the other side of this with something resembling a free world. Because I think that the trend right now is that we're going to end up in something that's just not, and that's unfortunate.
Which brings us, or brings me to a final question, which you sort of already answered, but maybe you could expand a little bit. Can democracies adapt fast enough?
Well, yeah, I mean, and that's kind of what we're seeing. I was just listening to this interview with Keir Starmer. I think it was from yesterday, talking about them trying to make sense of what's going on with Trump and tariffs and whatnot. And to be honest, if you look at the response from him, I think Trump just posted a text message that he got from Emmanuel Macron. I don't see the situational awareness from the people that are on the side of democracy in the West about what's happening. And I think that Trump is kind of using that fact to his advantage in pursuing this very illiberal program very quickly. And this whole Board of Peace thing, I mean, this is like the left-handed evil chiral version of NATO that he's trying to birth out of all this. And it's going to end up with like a handful of strongmen that try to impose their will on the rest of the world, all in the name of peace. And we got to do something about this. So no, I don't see that democracies are acting fast enough. My hope is that with this shock and awe campaign presently underway, people will potentially get the hint that we need to do something. But that's going to require, like the U.S. Congress waking up, for example. And it's not clear that that's, going to happen readily right now. So we'll see, but it's a very weird time.
Mr. Troy, I'd love to spend another, 30 minutes chatting about this super interesting topic, which both of us try to focus on as best as we can. Unfortunately, we have time constraints, and unfortunately, due to persistent Russian attacks, it is currently about 7 or 8 degrees in our studio, and it's pretty tough to to sit it through.
I bet.
Thank you so much for joining us, and hopefully sometime soon in either another episode of the Ukraine Insights or another project.
Absolutely. Would be happy to join you anytime, and best of luck with everything going on there. We're all standing with you.
If you enjoy Ukraine Insights, don't forget to subscribe, leave a review, and share this episode with a friend or colleague who follows developments in Ukraine. Your support helps us bring independent voices and informed perspectives to a global audience.